doesn't have to be this way. We urgently need to reimagine public education. And to do that, we need to recognize and challenge at least two important underlying features of our current framework. So first, the context behind this reduction of education to skills training. So when the government announced this education shift, this intention to prepare the next generation for the jobs that will meet them, this of meeting the needs of the private sector, this was a shock to me. I'd imagined this separation between school and business, and this felt like a violation of sorts. Education has to be more than simply aiming towards the job you will get after school. It has to be so much more than that. This reduction can be seen as especially ineffective given that the majority of our MLAs, those responsible for the construction of our social and political context, have a liberal arts background. So if you look through government, there's not much skills training there. So this was a shock, but it isn't new, actually, this marriage of education and business. In fact, they've always been intimately connected. The rise of modern schooling after the Second World War, school as we know it, more or less, was tied to capitalist production. The most strident advocates of public education were some of the most successful businessmen of the time. A more literate workforce was needed, and school was seen to provide that. Of course, the context of work at the time was very different. It was more uniform factory work, and we can see that reflected in some of the traditional rituals of school. So what we're facing with the government's focus on skills training and corporations coming into schools, like Home Depot sponsoring a school garden, for instance, is a more explicit articulation of this relationship, but unfortunately not a new relationship, but definitely one that needs to be challenged. Second, and connected to this first feature of school, is the role of charity in schools, the way we teach children to respond to social issues through charity. When my twins started kindergarten, by the end of the first few months, they had taken part in 2 food bank drives and multiple bake sales to raise money for all sorts of good causes. And I was glad that the school was providing an opportunity for my children to think about others, but I was deeply concerned that the only solution they were learning to address issues of poverty and hunger was to donate. The slogan of our schools has become, "Bring your money." Where are the lessons about the structural causes of these societal problems and what our political institutions can do about them? So as my children were taking cans up to school, they weren't learning that 1 in 5 children in BC live in poverty and go hungry. They weren't learning about the history of food banks, how they were in fact initially meant to be a temporary measure, but they've now been around for 30 years, becoming such a normal part of society that we never question their role and the extent to which they can actually address these big issues. Kids give year after year without wondering why children are still going hungry in BC. They weren't learning how to make meaningful change, systemic change. While we may feel glad that schools are fostering some kind of social responsibility through charity, we also need to be aware of the intimate connection between charity and business and the role of charity in capitalism, not as teaching, but as an opportunity to provide spaces for fostering certain characteristics in our children. The content of the curriculum is not as important as the development of these characteristics, which are, at the very least, flexibility to face an ever-changing world, critical thinking to question and challenge the status quo, and creativity to come up with alternative solutions and ways of being. Even if we believe in preparing students for employment, we have to recognize that the context of the job market has changed substantially since the rise of modern schooling. It's no longer a job for a lifetime. It's precarious, ever-changing labor. And for this context, we need flexibility, critical thinking, and creativity. But instead of preparing students for certain jobs, we actually need to prepare them for facing the big social issues of our time: inequality, climate change, racism, sexism, colonization, and reconciliation. And for that, we need to encourage flexibility, critical thinking, and creativity. For these challenges, we also need to encourage true democratic engagement to show students how to make systemic change, to encourage them to become citizens, not just fundraisers. Democracy's been reduced to voting every 4 years, only for people over the age of 18, but it should actually be a daily activity. We should do democracy every day. For that, we need schools themselves to become sites of democracy. And we have a public school like that here in Vancouver, although it's within the Gulf Island School District. So my kids have now gone back to school, to Windsor House, which describes itself as a free democratic school, or as we call it, a school where the kids get to choose what they want to learn. And it's not that this is an exceptional group of people at Windsor House. What makes them exceptional is simply their commitment to a process of full democracy. And it's hard work. So now Finn, our failed student, has come back to life. Last week he was coming back from Southlands Farm, which is one of the Windsor House sites this year, and he saw a student holding an egg carefully in some toilet paper. Turns out the student was going to try and hatch this egg at home. Finn was thrilled with this idea and came home bursting with the desire to do the same. That night, he practiced some questions, and the very next day he asked the farmer if he could do this and how he would know if the egg was fertilized. Then he came home and looked up how to make an incubator. You gotta love YouTube for that. And this weekend, we built an incubator. And Finn is now talking about temperature and humidity, not as abstract numbers, but as something that he has to control in his incubator, unless he wants to cook his eggs instead of hatch them. The knowledge and the consequences are real, and that's something we're denying our kids in the current system. This is the way public education could be. But we need a significant reinvestment from the provincial government to get us there, to disentangle school from business and charity, to promote schools as sites of democracy and students as citizens, to bring all those students that we're currently failing back to life, to face the challenges and opportunities of our time. Thank you.